of scientific literature that is available for IPCC to assess. And currently, it's running, I estimate, between 45,000 and 50,000 articles or pieces of output every year, which is becoming increasingly challenging to assess. And in fact, the literature has been doubling every IPCC cycle, which lasts about 6 or 7 years. So every time we have a new cycle, there is as much new literature as was ever produced before that cycle started. So this is a challenging issue. It's something we are thinking of how we do that. So the first report informed.
Okay, just hit okay. I'll go in. I'll go in.
Any chance of cutting?
They should be able to hear. Anyone online? Can you make sure that you've muted yourselves?
Okay, it's got a little quieter, but yeah, just to repeat the begging, please turn off your microphones if you're online. So the first report informed the signing of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Second report informed the Kyoto Protocol. And by the time we got to the Paris Agreement in 2015, it was the 5th assessment report of IPCC that raised the issue of 1.5 degrees as a limit or a threshold that moved things on. And the 6th cycle that just finished informed the UAE consensus that came out of COP28. So, and it also informed the global stocktake, the first of the 5-year assessments under the Paris Agreement. So IPCC has had a lot of influence over its 35 years. And I can tell you that COP28, every government that stood up said we have to believe in the science, we rely on the science, etc. So no pressure there in terms of producing things. I'm not getting any movement on this, maybe cutting off the. Whose laptop is operating this? You try that now. So nothing's happening. Using artificial intelligence to assess literature is going to be easy.
We need to change slides.
Yeah, that's the problem. My problem is that I have shuffled my slides for this talk, which I do about 3 times a week, and I can't remember which slide's coming up next. Otherwise, I would keep talking.
Not sure. Could you go to the next slide? So your screen sharing from here, is that it?
Yeah.
Okay.
might be the hour and a half after all.
Yeah. I think you should ask the questions first and then talk afterwards. Yes.
Why don't we do that?
So in terms of IPCC, so we can tell like maybe it's mainly focused on the climate change.
Yeah.
Does it address other science issues about, for example, biodiversity, land use?
Yeah, I mean, it does in practice, because certainly in working group 2, okay, we've got something, still doesn't move. Yeah. Okay, so, for example, working group 2 on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability would give a lot of consideration to biodiversity issues and the effects of climate change on natural systems. And then, of course, there is a sister assessment process, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES, which works in parallel with us. And in fact, we have had a shared workshop with IPBES to think about processes. And when I was at the UNEA, the UN Environment Assembly, about a month ago, I met with the David Abura, their chair, and we talked about means of collaborating on things like, for example, having a shared glossary of terms. I mean, it sounds very basic, but actually when we use the same words, we can mean different things. So we have actually been thinking about how to get a better collaboration with IPBES, and also the International Resources Panel, which also works in that area. I've got the next slide. This could be 10 minutes per slide of this process. It's not moving. Oh, that's wonderful. But a bit haphazardly.
Oh, no, that's me. So you tell me.
Oh, could you go back? Yeah, so just to say, it was very clear that governments were relying a lot on IPCC in the last cycle. So the governments, the Paris Agreement, the formal text of the Paris Agreement invited IPCC to produce a special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, which was a pretty influential report because it didn't invent the concept of net zero and carbon budgets, but it brought them to the world. And we were also asked to do special reports on climate change and land and the oceans and cryosphere. So just to say in answer to your question, this climate change and land report had a lot of material on biodiversity in there as well. So even up to the time of the last cycle, there were a lot of interest in asking IPCC to do specific things. So if I can now turn to the conclusions from the last cycle. And just to say, I got the entire outputs of the last cycle delivered to my new office across at the International Institute for Environment and Development, and it weighed 30 kilograms altogether. I've of course read every word in detail. So what I've been inclined to do, having to sum this all up in 10 minutes or so, is to base the conclusions around the 3 goals of the Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015. And there were basically 3 goals. First one is the so-called long-term temperature goal, which is limiting warming to well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5. The second one, which is about the ability to adapt to climate change and foster climate resilience. And the third one is about so-called means of implementation, making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And it is worthwhile emphasising that these goals are all co-equal. In Europe, there's a lot of attention to the first one, the long-term temperature goal, but for many developing countries, the other 2 goals have equal importance, perhaps greater importance point. So it's very important politically to keep things together, that each of these goals is actually pursued. And of course, what the phrase I missed out of these was all in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. So that was the contextual part of it. So as I mentioned, it's not just 1.5 degrees. There's an awful lot more to the goals of the Paris Agreement that we need to pursue and the IPCC needs to produce evidence on. So first of all, on the long-term temperature goal, the last report was pretty definite on where we need to be. It brought the concept of the carbon budget to the world, which is was 500 gigatons left, about 10 years worth of emissions when we produced the 1.5 degrees report. And now, according to some papers, it's down to about half that number for various reasons, the amount that's left. So what this shows for the whole century, the kind of pathways that you would need to be on in published scenarios to take you to 1.5 degrees, which is the blue bit, which gets you to net zero greenhouse gas emissions late in the 21st century, but net zero emissions of carbon dioxide on the right side a bit earlier, just after 2050, just about around the middle of the century. So a very crisp set of conclusions there, a lot of uncertainties around the scenarios. Now, if you bring it in a little closer to look at the period up till 2050, this is where we see a very firm conclusion that we are absolutely not on a pathway to reaching these kinds of goals. So the salmon pink slice at the top is what would happen to emissions if current policies were implemented and continued, roughly constant emissions. The blue line at the bottom shows the pathway you would need to be on to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And the green slice is if you had a good chance, greater than 2/3 chance of limiting warming to 2 degrees. The purple one is actually what would happen if we followed government's current pledges out to 2030 and then really accelerated efforts. This is a much steeper decrease, this purple one. And even then, by that time, you've lost the possibility of 1.5 degrees. And this is what you would have to do to limit warming to 2 degrees by that process of delay. So a very clear indication. There's an emissions gap in the sense that the pledges that governments have made don't add up to the pathways we would need to be on. And this, in fact, is a 43% reduction by 2030 compared to 2019, 60% by 2035, 69% by 2040. So these are the kind of numbers that are coming out there, and we are nowhere on track for that. So an emissions gap and also an implementation gap in the policies in place on the ground don't add up to actually meeting the pledges. So we've got these two gaps that are sitting there. Second goal of the Paris Agreement is about impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. And one of the things that you're probably familiar with that scientists have used heavily as a communication device is the so-called burning embers diagrams, where the intensity of the colour at different warming levels compared with pre-industrial reflects the level of risk. And a very high risk, which is the purple, is one that reflects a risk that is severe and irreversible. So these are the kind of risks that give you a sense of the calibration. There's a lot of detail to calculate it. So, but the big emphasis at the moment is that compared with the previous cycle of IPCC, which ended in 2015, the risks for particular systems are assessed to have to take place at lower warming levels than we previously thought. And that is coupled with the fact that in 2023, temperatures themselves were higher than anybody expected. So we've got two levels of anxiety there. One, that the world is warming potentially faster than we thought. And second, for a given level of warming, the level of risks that are associated are higher. So this is what they call so-called reasons for concern. They're a little bit high level and abstract, but unique and threatened systems refers to, for example, things like warm water corals, which we will lose completely if warming goes to 2 degrees. We'll maybe get about 25% if we limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Extreme weather events, which we've seen in the last year or so, obviously the risks perceived to be much higher. And the large-scale singular events at the end are things like melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet. These are the kind of specific things that are embodied there. Sorry, I'm pressing the button and forgetting using authority. Okay, so also the risks differ by system. These are land-based systems on the left, ocean coastal systems on the right. The biggest risk with the ocean systems is the warm water corals, which I have mentioned. But perhaps there's a lot of other anxieties more on the land-based side, which is wildfires, at which we're starting to see the risks elevating about the level we are at the moment, degradation of permafrost, biodiversity lost, which has just been mentioned, dry land water scarcity. So these are the kind of risks that we see coming through at warming, with the risks increasing at warming between 1.5 to 2 degrees. Now, the one other point I want to make on the resilience side is that it does, this is not beyond human control. If we put in place adaptive measures, we can actually reduce the risks associated with a given level of warming. So the left-hand side, I mean, these are just a couple of examples. There's not much else elsewhere. But for example, for heat-related morbidity and mortality, there are parts of the world where at some of these higher warming levels, it will not be possible to work outdoors safely for 365 days a year. That's the kind of levels that you're looking at say 3 degrees. But if you put in place adaptive measures, you can actually reduce these risks depending on the amount of adaptation you choose to put in place. The other thing that the risks depend on, because the risks are not only dependent on warming levels, they're dependent on the socioeconomic background conditions as well. But if you have a more favourable scenario, like this one, which is cryptically called SSP1, Shared Socioeconomic Pathway 1, which assumes the world follows a sustainable development path, you can reduce the risks of food insecurity very considerably compared to a world which is more business as usual, middle of the road kind of socioeconomic development. So an important message there, that by doing specific adaptive measures or changing the broad patterns of social and economic development, you can actually reduce the risks associated with a given level of climate change. Now, the final one is on the question of means of implementation and finance for climate action. And let me say right at the beginning that this figure refers to climate change mitigation only. And it's much easier to get numbers on climate change mitigation than on adaptation, because adaptation measures tend to be public goods that pay money, and they often tend to be tied in with broader development and infrastructure development. So there's a strong message we've got out here, and that's not covered by this figure, that actually funding for mitigation is actually in a much healthier state than it is for adaptation. And furthermore, about more than 90% of the financing for adaptation is coming from public sources, not private sources. Whereas in mitigation case, you can get a lot more private flows because there is a metric that you can invest against, your dollars per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. So mitigation investment for the private sector is actually much easier. So this diagram refers only to mitigation. And I'm sorry for the shape of it, because it comes from an underlying report, because we had a tremendous amount of struggle getting this diagram agreed by governments and couldn't get it into the summary for policymakers. So it is taken from the underlying chapter rather than the summary for policymakers. I can tell you the reason for it if you ask questions about it. So the solid blue bit is an estimate of the amount of annual financial flow that's going in for specific types of measure by sector at the top, different regions of the world. That's the solid blue part of it. The grey bars at the moment are estimates of the range of investment that would be needed by 2030 to get you on a pathway towards 1.5 or 2 degrees warming. And the headline figure is that for these mitigation activities, not adaptation, it's worse for adaptation, you would need to increase the level of financial flows by a factor of between 2 and 6 if you were actually going to get yourself onto the more ambitious mitigation pathways. The gap is lowest for energy supply and the electricity sector, where there's plenty of opportunities for renewable energy out there. The gaps are much bigger for energy efficiency, for transport, and for measures in the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector, where in fact the gaps, if you look there, it's a factor of between 10 and 30 would be the level of scaling up that would be needed for the agriculture, forestry and land use measures. And just to say very quickly, the gaps are much bigger for developing countries than they are for developed countries. And that was the contentious point when we were approving this report and trying to get it into our summary for policymakers. Now, just to say, I mean, one of the things policymakers asked us to do in the last cycle was to pay a lot more attention to near-term action and what the possibilities were. So this figure, which has been used very heavily by journalists, shows the potential contribution to emissions reductions on the timescale 2030 for various measures in the energy supply sector. There's only energy supply, we also do it for transport and buildings. And just to give you a sense, global emissions may be around 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So this scale is going to up to about 10% of global emissions overall. And the big message, there's an awful lot that can be done in the energy sector. So the two big items are associated with renewable energy, it's wind energy and solar energy are the two things that possible. We've seen huge changes in developments in renewable energy, falling costs, increased take-up, to the point that wind and solar now account for about 10% of global electricity generation, starting from scratch almost. I would also flag here the one at the bottom, which is reduced methane emissions from oil and gas systems. Methane is a particularly potent greenhouse gas, and so reducing methane emissions can have a relatively quick effect on global warming. And frankly, oil and gas companies have not been looking at ways of reducing methane emissions. Now they've figured it out, they realise they can probably make more money from selling the methane than leaking it into the atmosphere. So there's a lot of progress at the moment being made with methane reductions as well. The other thing I want to flag out is the colour scheme on this diagram. It's not just for the aesthetics. The colours are meant to represent the relative costs of the different measures. So if it's blue, it's actually an estimate that it has a negative cost. If it would make sense to do this, even if climate change was not happening. And you can see that's about half of the potential for wind and solar energy. And I think about half of the overall potential is associated with measures that cost less than about $100 per tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is not so different from the price of permits being sold under the EU emissions trading scheme at the moment. So there's a lot of potential to do things very quickly. And I have to say, one of the biggest barriers, most of the take-up of wind and solar has been in China, the US and Europe. It has not taken place so much in other parts of the world. And there are two big barriers here. One being not the capital cost of the wind and solar, the cost of capital, how much it costs to borrow money to put the installations in. And the other factor is the limited grid capacity in many other parts of the world, including developing countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, which is a big challenge. So actually realising that potential has its challenges, even though nominally the cost looks quite promising. And this final one, I'll tell my old joke at this point, but a good figure can save you 1,000 words, and an IPCC figure takes 1,000 words to explain. So I'm not going to explain this one very much. I'm not going to go in detail. Let's pick up the big messages. You saw in the Paris Agreement slide, in the context of sustainable developments and efforts to eradicate poverty, one of the things that we systematically did in the last report was to map lots of different climate interventions, both mitigation and adaptation, against each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And looking at the literature, assessed whether there were more likely to be synergies between climate action and each of the Sustainable Development Goals, or whether they were trade-offs. And to summarise this very quickly, blue is a good thing, that's synergies. Orange is a bad thing, that's trade-offs. And you can see just from an impression there that the message is that there are many more synergies and trade-offs between climate action and the individual sustainable development goals. I'll just give a very straightforward example. The move to renewable energy coupled with the electrification of transport will result in improved air quality in urban areas, which has very positive impacts for health. Very, very obvious, and there are many other such examples. The orange bits that you need to look out for, and I think you mentioned biodiversity and bioenergy at the beginning, which has been a particularly controversial topic for IPCC. There is a risk that measures that involve the rapid scale up on a very large scale of bioenergy could take up agricultural land with implications for biodiversity and for food security. And that's where some of the orange parts of these pictures are coming in. So the dominant message is there are more synergies and trade-offs, but watch out for where the risks are, because they do need to be managed. Now, for the last part of the talk, I'm going to talk about a little bit about, be a bit more forward-looking and talk about how IPCC interacts with the policy process and what our plans are for the coming cycle. So just to say, we do have formalised interactions with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and our main link is with the subsidiary body for scientific and technical advice, known as SBSTA for short. And we meet with SBSTA every 6 months at each of the conferences of the parties when they take place, and also intersessional subsidiary bodies meeting, all of which take place in Bonn. And on our side, the chair goes along, the secretariat, which is based in Geneva, the co-chairs of the working groups and the co-chairs of the task force and inventories go along from the IPCC side. And SBSTA, it's the UNFCCC secretariat, but also government representatives of the constituted bodies under the Framework Convention. I hope I don't have to describe how UNFCCC works, because we'd be here all Easter weekend to do that. But they include, for example, a standing committee on finance, an adaptation committee, the least developed countries expert group. And we also, when we go along these processes, we provide a lot of support for processes such as the global stocktake, which takes place under the Paris Agreement. So we were submitting papers, engaging with government representatives at these global stocktake processes. And just to say, we also have many other formal speeches and interventions. I get the joy of doing a formal speech at the opening session of COP alongside other dignitaries. We get involved in interministerial dialogues. I was in Copenhagen last week for a climate ministerial, which involved Al Jaber, the COP28 president, etc., various government representatives, and we participate in various side events. And what I won't put on the screen, since it will leave a legacy, we also engage with the UNFCCC Secretariat about some of the decision texts that might be coming out. For example, if they're going to invite IPCC to do something, they consult us as to whether we're likely to be able to accept the invitation, and we will kind of fine-tune the text before it's finally agreed. So we are interacting quite strongly with the UNFCCC process. And part of that dialogue involves receiving invitations from the Framework Convention. And these are some of the things that have come up. And I'm sorry there's so many words on the screen, which I try not to do, but I've bolded out the ones I think are most important. Okay, so at COP28 in Dubai, we were invited to consider how best to align our work with the second and subsequent global stocktakes, and invites us to provide relevant and timely information. Okay, so the next global stocktake is in 2028. We'll finish in 2028, so we're being invited to think about how we can contribute to that. And the subsequent global stocktakes every 5 years, so the second one the third global stocktake altogether would be in 2033. This was actually from COP27 rather than COP28, the one in Egypt, inviting us to consider updating ancient technical guidelines for assessing climate change impacts on adaptation as part of its seventh cycle. Very, very specific request. I might say when I looked at that, and so I went back to look at the technical guidelines and discovered when I was almost in short pants that I was one of the experts that helped to draft the guidelines. And I've managed to completely forget about it, which is a considerable achievement. Right. And the final one, this is actually an invitation for the subsidiary bodies, including Substa, but the subsidiary body and implementation as well, to think about the global goal on adaptation, which was established at Sharm el-Sheikh, and think about how to build on the best available science, including collaboration with IPCC. So it's not a direct invitation to us, it's an invitation to the subsidiary bodies to work with us to produce some of their outputs. So we're getting on to what we're actually planning to do in the light of all that. We had the first meeting of the seventh cycle in Istanbul in January, and this was my first meeting chairing IPCC, and it turned out to last a little longer than we expected because we were supposed to finish at 6 o'clock on Friday evening, and we didn't walk out the building till 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, having negotiated all night just to get the programme of work agreed. And it's a surprisingly conservative programme of work, considering all the hours that went into it. So the panel decided that we will produce the same 3 usual working group reports: physical science, impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, and mitigation. The panel also decided they had to take place in that order, unless it decided to do differently afterwards. So it would need to be in the order working groups 1, 2, and 3. What the governments could not agree on was the timing of these reports precisely. So the Bureau, the elected scientific leadership, was invited to prepare a programme which said the month and year of delivery of each of these elements of the seventh cycle. So the Bureau is meeting in late May, and the next plenary will take place in late July, at which we will hopefully take decisions, depending on the quality of the chairing, take decisions about the programme of work. And we could move it on, look at the other elements. Okay, a long time ago, back in 2016, the governments agreed that a special report on climate change in cities would be produced during the seventh cycle. And it had actually been proposed alongside the 1.5 report, the land report, and the oceans report, but it lost out because of lack of capacity. So as a compromise 7 or 8 years ago, governments agreed a special report on climate change in cities would be produced at the start of the seventh cycle. And governments agreed on that. In fact, we've already started on the process. And next month, we're having a scoping meeting to decide what the shape of that special report on climate change in cities will look like. There was another important decision, and this refers to the task force on inventories. At the end of the last cycle, there was a massive debate, which my colleague Ali Al-Qudraji will recall, about what we meant by abated and unabated fossil fuel emissions. And that came back when the UAE agreement was being drafted. So as a reaction to that, governments want more information about what abated and unabated means. So there is going to be an expert meeting held by the Task Force on Inventories on carbon dioxide removal technologies. Note technologies, it doesn't refer to nature-based solutions, that's outside the scope of this, but also on carbon capture, utilisation, storage, and to produce a methodology report, which is a set of recommendations on how governments report their emissions to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which governments hope will resolve all these issues about abated and unabated emissions. And I can already see the task force and inventory coming into the political crossfires with this one. We're also asked to do expert meetings and workshops. We didn't do enough of these in the last cycle because we were too busy. I'll move it on. I think this is the last real slide. The the governments, as IPCC, did agree to produce a distinct project revising and updating the technical guidelines on impacts and adaptation. And what governments particularly want is an emphasis on indicators, metrics, and methodologies that would allow progress towards the global goal on adaptation to actually be measured. So that's a critical part of it, is trying to get impacts and adaptation to be more quantitative and measurable. We had a bit of a debate about this one, and the final decision is that it would be produced alongside the Working Group 2 report. The authors would be appointed at the same time. The lead author meetings would take place simultaneously, but it would be produced as a separate and distinct product that governments could pick out and use separately. And just the very final one, governments also agreed that there should be a synthesis report for the 7th assessment cycle, which has been a custom, a practice that IPCC has had in all previous cycles. There was some debate about it, and I thought it was another easy time. It's the chair's responsibility to produce the synthesis report, and if it wasn't produced, I could spend my next 5 years making speeches and going to nice dinners, but it was not to be. A synthesis report is going to be produced. So that is basically where we are at the moment. I hope I've emphasised that IPCC in its previous cycles has really had a lot of influence on climate diplomacy and policy making, perhaps more at the international level than at the detailed national or subnational level. But now the expectations on us are really, really high for what we actually do in the next cycle. And my slight anxiety is that the closer you get to policy, the more difficult it gets because the science gets more controversial. So we are going to have fun over the next 5 or 6 years, but I think that's it. Yeah, this is just an illustration of how a meeting can go. Everybody walks into the building all hopeful. This is an orderly meeting in the top right-hand corner. Everybody's sitting in their places, the chair looking after things. This is when it gets difficult and people are running into huddles afterwards and arguing with each other offline about what the text would be before the chair gets the pleasure of travelling down whatever they came up with 16 hours late. So that's what it's like. That's the presentation. Thanks for your attention.
Anyone has one now?
Yeah, maybe it's a question that's then open to that's the open interpretation. But do we at the moment have the technical capabilities to bring the curve from red to purple? And I mean, like current technical capabilities. I mean, without inventing fusion, for example, without making fusion.
Right.
Do we have the?
Yeah, I think we do, but we need to take action on both mitigation and adaptation to do it. I mean, obviously, you know, the slogan at the moment is keep 1.5 alive. It's obviously it's hanging on a thread at the moment. I think well understand. And you know, some countries would argue that we hadn't actually signed up to 1.5. We'd signed up to well below 2 in pursuing efforts to 1.5, which is not quite the same. So we're somewhere between the 1.5 and 2 degree bracket. I still think 2 degrees is absolutely possible. We have the means, as we illustrated, the renewable energy, the efficiency that are all picked up, avoided deforestation, the very obvious things that can be done quickly. So I think it can be done, but it also needs adaptation as well, because we can already see the effects of climate change already. We can see them already. It's not something for the future. It's happening now. So we do need adaptation measures that can help to get the risks down.
Thank you for your presentation. I was very curious about the governance and the decision-making process that you should have to navigate. So you mentioned that the IPCC is owned by governments and you are subject to the agreement of members, but that you also have that sort of formal advisory role with the UNFCCC as well, and the parties that come together under the framework and things like COP. What is the sequence of decision-making, proposals, approvals that you have to walk through in order to actually get from the debates that you chair to the actual outputs?
Right, okay, well, I mean, it takes 3 to 4 years to produce a report altogether. So the first thing is the government's taking decisions like they did in Istanbul in January to produce a report. Then we go to a scientific scoping meeting to think about what the structure of the report would be. And to do that, governments, unobserver organisations have to nominate experts to go to that scoping meeting. And the Bureau selects from that list of nominations who goes to the scoping meeting. And we need to take into account scientific competence, gender, regional balance, especially developing countries, etc., the whole kind of range. And just to say, there's an intense competition to do it. For the city scoping meeting, we got 1,300 nominations for 100 places. So the process of selecting, you get really quite contentious to make sure regions, etc., are balanced properly. When they produce a draft scope, it needs to go to a plenary meeting. So the city's report, the scoping meeting will take place next month, and the proposed scope will go to the next plenary at the end of July, where governments need to sign it off. And usually they don't change the chapter structure, but they can play with the bullet points under each chapter and negotiate it. Only then can we invite governments to nominate authors after they write the report, once we know what the structure is going to be. So again, the Bureau selects the authors and goes through the process. And then each report has to be reviewed twice before it's finalised. Once purely expert review, second time an expert plus a government review. And each of these reviews they need 8 weeks to actually do it. Plus the authors do need a little bit of time to write the report as well, so somewhere that next process. And once you've done that, after the government review, there's a revision of the draft, which becomes the final draft. And at the same time, a second draft of the summary for policymakers is sent to governments, which they can comment on again. And then you take it to the approval session, where the summary for policymakers, for 20 or 30 pages, is gone through word by word, sentence by sentence, till absolutely everything is agreed. And these are the most difficult sessions, because you can just expect them to run overnight at the end to get finished, because getting consensus is quite difficult. And at that point, there may be consequential changes to the underlying report, depending on how the SPM is signed off. And there would be these minor adjustments made to the underlying report before we finish it. And by the time you've all done that, you're into 3 or 4 years to get the job done. You're giving at least 6 months between lead authors meetings to allow authors trying to draft. So it is a long and painful process. The value of it is when you walk out of it, every single government has signed up to it and cannot back away. And the scientists have agreed with it as well. So it's a particularly powerful message going into the Framework Convention that nobody can back away from because of the previous intergovernmental agreement. So it's slow and it's painful, but it has its impact. So.
Thank you.
I have 2 questions, if that's okay. First question, so at the beginning of your presentation, you went through that the IPCC, they don't do their own individual analysis of data literature, and that in the past 10 years, there's been a massive increase in the amount of literature that is being published and being synthesized, and you made a comment about using AI to go through literature. Kind of not at the same rate as the increase in literature being published. There's also been an increase in the amount of papers that are being retracted or redacted because either the data's fake or been manipulated to an extreme extent or has been stolen. So I was just wondering if you have any comments on how that's going to be taken into account when reviewing papers in the future, because there probably are some fake papers.
Well, if it's been retracted, yeah, then we have to take it out of the assessment. Absolutely. But, I mean, the question is how can you keep a track on that? But just to say, I mean, you are assessing literature as a whole. So if there are some papers that the results have been faked or whatever, they're probably not going to stand up within the overall body of literature and where the consensus, if there is a consensus, might actually lie. And just to say, IPCC's principles and procedures do say that you, up to the authors, have to reflect different views that are in the literature. And if there are substantially different views, they effectively report them. side by side. So it's not a democracy, as it were. You would have to report that.
Second question. So hydrogen is an indirect greenhouse gas, but not really being accounted for in any emissions reporting or any climate change goals. So I was wondering, like, how would future potential climate risks such as hydrogen emissions from large hydrogen economies, how would those be taken into account in the work IPCC does?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So I mentioned that there's another expert meeting taking place on short with climate forces, which is to think about all the things that are not actually covered. And just to say that these would not be, I mean, the models that the mitigation community can produce estimates of these emissions, which are then fed into the formal physical models that were done by colleagues in Working Group 1. And it's worthwhile saying that there was a huge amount of collaboration between Working Groups 1 and 3 in the last cycle to make sure that the handshake was done properly. On Working Group 3 in particular made heavy use of reduced complexity climate models to process all of the emission scenarios that it was assessing and look at the climate change outcomes. There's more work to be done there. Scenarios are the most sensitive thing, scientifically the most sensitive thing in IPCC, of which I keep telling one, the scenarios chapter is 6% of the text, 25% summary, and 90% of the green part afterwards. Honestly, it is difficult.
I'm going to have a look at some questions from online. First off, this week, Gavin Schmidt said the 2023 climate records were hard to explain. And another professor said the pace of climate breakdown is faster than the majority of climate scientists are anticipating, and that there are concerns that some of our estimates could be on the conservative side. Do you agree? How optimistic or pessimistic are you about the future?
Yeah, can I innocently say I don't know as an answer to that? I mean, I'm going down to the Met Office in Exeter tomorrow, and I'm going to be drilling them on these very issues to try and understand it better. As I understand it, a lot of what happened in the last year can be explained. We were at an El Nino cycle, so you do expect faster warming than usual, but nevertheless, it appears that some of the figures, particularly for ocean temperatures, are quite off the scale. On the other hand, Allah, you sent me a tweet from Glenn Peters that said it wasn't exceptional at all, and that we've seen these kind of big spikes and changes before in El Nino cycles. Yeah.
That's right, yeah, but I think he got back onto that because of a tweet by Stephen Frankhauser, and he convinced him otherwise. So I think the jury is still out, but Gavin Schmidt came pretty strong this week and last week. He wanted to explain
how might it be possible for PhD students to get involved in the upcoming special reports you had mentioned, and how are contributing authors selected?
Right. Okay. So just to say, lead authors are selected by the process that I just mentioned. They need to be nominated by governments and observer organisations, then selected from that list by the Bureau. So the key thing, depending on which country you're in, is to make sure that your focal point nominates you. The Descents, which does it in the UK, will advertise quite widely, and basically they don't select from the people who express an interest. They pass them all on to us to make our job more difficult and give us hard work. They don't select at all. If you're coming from a developing country, it can be a little bit harder. And many of the focal points are based in Met Offices of agencies, and they tend to nominate people that they know. So for Working Groups 2 and Working Groups 3, we often get meteorologists trying to do mitigation or adaptation work, which is not always most appropriate. We're actually working on that with African colleagues who understand the problem. Just to say, contributing authors actually has a specific meaning in IPCC, capital C, capital A, and these are authors who might be invited by the lead authors who are directly involved in producing the text to contribute paragraphs or small amounts of information. So contributing author is a specific role. Now, on PhD students specifically, if you're not selected to be an author, you can still review the reports. Anybody can review reports at an expert stage. So just look out for when the reports are coming along for the two main review stages. You can sign up as a reviewer, you sign your confidentiality agreement, put your reports in, and your comments will be considered and responded to like every other comment. Now, just to say, on younger scientists, one of the things we've been working with in the last cycle, we were particularly concerned about career building for younger scientists in developing countries. And we ran a chapter scientists scheme where we advertised for people who want to be from a developing country to act as chapter scientists, which is frankly doing the grunt work for a chapter, checking references, making sure the figures are right. But what we discovered during that process is that people they became co-authors of paper, they started to get engaged in global networks. And that's something we're aiming to continue at the moment. I'm looking out for philanthropic money that would allow us to get the resources to expand that out across IPCC. And very final things, when IPCC got the Nobel Prize in 2007 along with Al Gore, the money was used to establish a scholarship fund, again for young PhD students from developing countries. And there are other philanthropic organisations that have tossed money into that pot. So there's maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 PhD students being funded by IPCC in the area of climate change each year. So we are actually thinking quite a lot about engagement with younger people as well.
And the last question online, for the AR7 timeline, what pathways do you still see towards the IPCC informing the next global stocktake? Are there any, and what are those?
Yeah. I mean, one of the propositions as we went into that Istanbul meeting in January is that there would be another special report that might be targeted, at least informally targeted towards the second global stocktake. The governments could not come up with a single coherent proposal that we could build a consensus around. So it's the 3 working group reports and the cities report that are potentially available. The working group co-chairs think they have a timetable by which all 3 working group reports will be out in time to inform the global stocktake in 2028. Now, we've consulted carefully with UNFCCC about meeting the global stocktake and what it actually means, because it's not an event, it's a process that will start in late 2026. The UNFCCC Secretariat have assured us that as long as a report is done by 31st of October 2028, they can use it for the global stocktake in next month, November 2028. And one of the reasons for that is there are other ways of engaging with IPCC, for example, through webinars. Countries will be aware of the reports in draft form, etc. So there are other ways of getting the information across. But that, it remains to be seen whether governments accept the timetable as proposed by the working group co-chairs, but they think they can do it.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone.
So just follow up on that, does that mean the report has to be approved? SPM has to be approved by the 31st?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's the target, yeah.
I've been shaking off the second one. Are you able to give us an understanding of what it's like for you as chair to navigate the political complexity of overseeing this process? And if you can comment on it, do you experience a huge amount of lobbying for different positions?
Well, I mean, I'm very, very aware that it is a deeply political process. And one of the things I think I would be a bit concerned about this cycle is a bit of the global north, global south divide coming on that's much stronger. This question of, is it all about the long-term temperature goal, or is it about wider issues? And there's a lot of things going on, particularly about the scenarios and the degree to which their assumptions reflect equitable socioeconomic assumptions. That is a big debate at the moment. I have to say, well, I think you can confirm that, I've been pushing the modelling community to actually change their practices a little and get far more developing country involved right from the beginning of projects to give a lot more credibility to it. So I think we need to look out for that global north-south, kind of issue. And it's not so much that governments lobby. I mean they wait until they hold their cards close to the chest, then they wait until the actual negotiations and keep it going for hours and hours. And the one with the deepest pocket for a travel budget and the strongest bladder gets the one.
All right, that's all we got time for. Thank you, and please give a round of applause.